On February 20th, 2026, at precisely 2:18 in the afternoon, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney made his solitary approach to a podium inside the National Press Theatre in Ottawa. He had no aides with him. No ministers flanked him. There was no announced agenda, no preview of what was coming. Less than an hour's notice had been given for the news conference, yet live broadcasts were already being carried by cameras from every major network in North America and across the world. The Prime Minister adjusted the microphone, stared straight into the cameras, and stood in a crowded, silent room. 4 minutes and 17 seconds of words that altered everything ensued. "I'm George Will. I'm a conservative columnist for the Washington Post, and I've spent my career observing the intricate dance between political philosophy, cultural currents, and the enduring principles that shape our republic. Today, I want to illuminate what's truly at stake, how our institutions are faring, and the profound implications of our choices for the American experiment. If this analysis speaks to something you care about, the health of our alliances, the integrity of our institutions, the long arc of American leadership, I invite you to subscribe to this channel wherever you may be watching from, whether from Washington or Warsaw, from Ottawa or Ontario, from London or Los Angeles. Hit the like button and share this with someone who still believes that clear thinking matters. Now let us proceed." Carney read his remarks calmly and deliberately, straight from the page. He refused to take questions. He did not pause for reaction or applause. He said only what his nation, and indeed a considerable portion of the watching world, had been waiting months to hear from a Western leader. When he was finished, he folded his statement, turned away from the podium, and left without looking back. Within minutes, the video went viral across every major social media platform. Within an hour, world leaders had begun to respond. In less than 90 minutes, the President of the United States posted a series of messages on social media that transformed what was already a serious diplomatic crisis into something considerably more dangerous. A potential rupture between two countries that share the world's longest undefended border. What we are witnessing is not a trade dispute. It is not a diplomatic disagreement between adjacent nations that will be resolved with a handshake and a phone call. A connection that has shaped North American security, prosperity, and identity for 3 generations is being strained to its breaking point. Whether that connection can ever be fully restored, or whether February 20th, 2026 will be remembered as the day the American era in North America began to close, will depend on what transpires in the days ahead. To understand why Carney chose this particular moment, these particular words, and this particular manner of delivery, alone, unannounced before the cameras of the world, one must examine the 24 hours that preceded it, as well as the wider consequences now unfolding for both countries. Early on February 19th, 2026, Toyota, one of the largest automakers in the world, announced that it was shifting $9 billion in planned investment from the United States to Canada. That single announcement shook American manufacturing communities. It financially and publicly validated everything Carney's government had been arguing, that Canada was presenting itself as a more stable, reliable, and attractive destination for international investment than an increasingly unpredictable United States under the current administration. The president was immediately incensed. He posted on Truth Social at 11:47 that morning with his characteristic bluntness. He called Toyota's decision a grave error. He said Canada would be pleading to become the 51st state in the Union. He characterized Canada as a frigid wasteland with a joke economy that survived only because, in his words, we let them sell to us. He concluded, as he habitually does, by dismissing Canada's leadership as weak and sad. That post landed like a grenade in Ottawa. Prime Minister Carney convened an emergency cabinet meeting at 3 o'clock that afternoon. According to those familiar with the proceedings, the 2-hour session covered both the political ramifications and the question of how to respond. A number of senior ministers advocated for the usual approach, a controlled, carefully worded diplomatic reply through official channels. They counseled patience. They urged moderation. They maintained that Canada could not afford the risk of openly escalating tensions with Washington. Carney, by all accounts, listened to everything and then declined. His reasoning, as conveyed by those present, was clear and direct. He maintained that the era of tactful diplomatic responses was finished. He argued that the current Washington administration had made its position unmistakably clear through its actions, through tariffs that breached existing trade agreements, through the disregard of treaty obligations, and through this most recent public humiliation, that it did not regard Canada as a partner. It regarded Canada as a subordinate, and Carney had decided that Canada would no longer accept that characterization. At 6:30 that evening, the Prime Minister placed calls to several heads of government, the leaders of the United Kingdom, Japan, France, Germany, and Australia. The calls were brief but consequential. Carney told each leader that he planned to make a significant public announcement the following day, one that would fundamentally alter Canada's relationship with the United States. He asked implicitly for their understanding and support. All 5 leaders indicated in their own ways that they understood. Each assured him that his country would stand with Canada. This detail is not a footnote. It was the cornerstone of Carney's entire approach. In the most important sense, he did not walk to that podium alone. He walked to it with the quiet assurance that the principal members of the Western Alliance, Britain, Australia, France, Germany, and Japan, had already indicated their support. He had the confidence to know that Canada would not be diplomatically isolated regardless of Washington's response. The United States would be. The following morning, Carney briefed his full cabinet on what he intended to say. He read the text to them. Those present reported that the room fell silent when he finished. Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland asked the one question that hung over the room. Was he certain this was the right course of action? Carney's answer was brief and definitive. He said that the relationship, as they had known it, was already over. It had been ended by the other side. He was merely formalizing it. Carney's remarks, which have since been cited in editorial pages, broadcast studios, and parliaments around the world, began at 2:18 in the afternoon. He opened by acknowledging the framework that had guided Canadian policy for 3/4 of a century. For 75 years, he said, Canada had operated on the assumption that the United States stood at the center of the international system. Canada's economy had been built around access to American markets. Its security architecture had been constructed around the American alliance. Supporting American leadership on the world stage had been the cornerstone of its foreign policy. He said that assumption was no longer valid. He then set out the conclusions his government had reached. The current administration in Washington had demonstrated through its actions as much as its words that it did not value genuine partnership. International accords had not been honored. The sovereignty of neighbors had been disregarded. These were not charges made in anger. They were observations offered as matters of fact. And then came the line that stopped the room. Canada, he declared, would not wait for America to reaffirm its values. Canada was moving on from the American era as it and the rest of the world had known it. He folded his statement, turned from the podium, and walked out as reporters erupted with questions behind him. He did not turn around. He did not pause. He did not smile or wave to soften the exit. He simply walked away. 90 minutes later, the diplomatic crisis was transformed into something still more hazardous when Donald Trump responded with 4 consecutive posts on Truth Social. The first vowed that this would not stand and accused Carney of having declared war on the United States. The second proposed a comprehensive review of all United States-Canada accords, including NORAD, the combined military aerospace defense command that has safeguarded North American airspace since 1958, as well as commercial agreements and intelligence sharing arrangements. The third threatened increased inspections at all border crossings, with the clear implication that Canada might be treated as a foreign adversary if it so desired. Then came the fourth post, and it was the first of its kind in the history of the two nations' contemporary relations. Trump addressed the Canadian people directly, not their government, and told them that the United States was prepared to welcome any Canadian province that wished to join the greatest country in the world, that their government was failing them, and that they deserved better leadership. Consider what that represents. The President of the United States did not merely question Canadian trade policy. He did not merely threaten more tariffs. He extended an explicit invitation to Canadian provinces to secede from Canada and join the United States. This is not economic negotiation. This is a direct assault on the territorial integrity and sovereignty of a neighbor. Under any other circumstances involving any other two countries, a statement of that character would be regarded as a precursor to something far more serious than a trade disagreement. The events that unfolded in the hours following Carney's remarks and Trump's reply exposed something that the foreign policy establishment in Washington had long feared but not fully anticipated. America's traditional allies were prepared to stand with Canada. Britain responded first. Prime Minister Keir Starmer issued a statement at 4:15 that afternoon. It was measured in its wording, as British diplomatic declarations tend to be. Its meaning, however, was unmistakable. The United Kingdom, he said, cherished its relationships with both Canada and the United States, but the UK was a firm supporter of the rules-based international order and the principle that sovereign states must be respected. Canada's concerns, the statement concluded, were legitimate and deserved to be heard. Read the subtext plainly. Britain told Washington it was wrong. For a century, the United Kingdom has been America's closest partner in every significant crisis. When Britain openly validates Canada's grievances against the United States, even in diplomatically restrained language, it signals a fundamental shift in Western alliance structure. The European Union's top foreign policy official then affirmed that unilateral actions violating international agreements were unacceptable. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese reaffirmed his country's solidarity with Canada on sovereign equality and fair trade. Japan's foreign ministry stated that it understood Canada's position and supported relationships grounded in mutual respect. Japan, Australia, the European Union, Britain. These are not peripheral actors in the international system. These are America's principal allies, the nations that stood with Washington through every major crisis of the past century. Within hours of Carney's statement, they had all, in precisely calibrated but unmistakable diplomatic language, indicated that Canada was correct and that the United States had crossed a line. Because this crisis is so frequently framed as a trade disagreement which fundamentally understates its severity, it is important to be clear about what is actually at risk. The relationship between the United States and Canada is not merely economic. It is a security relationship. It is an intelligence relationship. It is a military relationship. The foundation of that relationship is the shared conviction that these two nations hold the same values, face the same threats, and will stand by one another when it matters most. Trade flows are significant, but they represent only a fraction of the bonds that bind these two countries. NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, is the military institution that monitors the skies above North America and provides early warning of ballistic missile attacks and other aerial threats. It has operated continuously since 1958. Its headquarters are in Colorado Springs, but its command structure is fully integrated with Canadian military personnel at every level. Canadian radar installations in the Arctic provide coverage of the northern approaches to North America that no American station can replicate. Without those installations and that coverage, American early warning systems have significant blind spots that hostile nations have studied and could exploit. When Trump threatened to review the NORAD agreement, he was not endangering Canada. He was endangering the United States. He was posing a threat to American national security. The generals and admirals at the Pentagon understand this, even if the president does not. The Five Eyes intelligence sharing arrangement, which also includes Britain, Australia, and New Zealand, is, if anything, even more consequential to American security. The intelligence services of the participating nations exchange information so extensively and consistently that they function, in practical terms, as a single cohesive entity, sharing intelligence on foreign espionage, cyber attacks, terrorist planning, and geopolitical developments in real time. If the intelligence relationship with Canada degrades, if Canadian agencies begin withholding information, or if American agencies are excluded from Canadian networks, the United States loses capabilities that no other arrangement can replace. Both nations become considerably less secure, but America, as the primary target of the majority of threats that Five Eyes monitors, stands to lose the most. The border itself deserves mention. The United States-Canada boundary stretches 5,525 miles, the world's longest international border, and it has operated throughout contemporary North American history on a foundation of mutual trust. There are no walls, no military installations along its length, only checkpoints at authorized crossings. If the president carries out his threat to treat Canada as a foreign adversary, stationing troops along the northern border as he has along the southern one, the daily flow of trade and people will effectively cease. Communities dependent on cross-border commerce will suffer economic destruction, and the goodwill that has made North America the world's most stable and prosperous region for 8 decades will be replaced by mistrust and fear. The state of affairs inside the federal government in Washington is best described as controlled chaos. The Pentagon is in crisis mode. Senior military officers are attempting to convey to the White House the catastrophic implications of threatening NORAD and the intelligence sharing architecture. The Secretary of Defense reportedly requested an immediate meeting with the president to address the NORAD situation. As of this writing, no date has been set. Career diplomats at the State Department who have spent decades building the United States-Canada alliance are scrambling to open back channels with Ottawa, but the president's public remarks are consistently undercutting their efforts. If Carney meets with Trump now, after Trump has publicly invited Canadian provinces to join the United States, it looks like surrender. No democratically elected leader can endure that perception. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer and Senate Republican Leader Mitch McConnell issued a rare joint statement urging calm and communication between the two governments. The statement acknowledged that the relationship's present trajectory was deeply concerning and called on both governments to refrain from further escalation. It was a notable occasion, two leaders who agree on nearly nothing finding common ground, but there is a significant limitation to what it means. Congress cannot override executive action on military agreements and border policy. The president can carry out his threats without congressional consent. Schumer and McConnell's statement was an appeal, not a constraint. In Ottawa, the Carney government is preparing for every contingency, including the most severe. Canadian military forces have been placed on heightened alert, not because anyone in Ottawa expects actual armed conflict, but because sound governance demands readiness when the language emanating from a neighboring country's leader is this alarming. At the same time, Canada is accelerating discussions on trade agreements, investment frameworks, and security cooperation with its Asian and European partners. The message Ottawa is sending is deliberate and unambiguous. If the United States wishes to treat Canada as an adversary, Canada will build new alliances that circumvent America entirely. History teaches us that crises of this kind seldom resolve cleanly. They tend to follow one of 3 trajectories, and all 3 remain technically possible at this moment. The first is emergency de-escalation. Senior figures from both nations, former heads of government, respected elder statesmen, intervene behind the scenes, facilitate a private conversation, and both leaders agree to a cooling-off period. Some threatened tariff increases are suspended. The situation stabilizes. But here is the critical caveat. A handshake cannot fully repair the trust that the events of the past 48 hours have eroded. The 75-year assumption that Carney described, the foundational premise that had guided Canadian policy for 3 generations, is no longer in place. One successful summit cannot rebuild it. The second scenario is a slow-motion Cold War. Neither side backs down. Tariffs remain. The hostile rhetoric persists. The two nations essentially cease collaborating on everything except what is specifically required by existing treaty obligations. Trade volumes decline sharply. NORAD continues to function, but at diminished effectiveness. The border becomes a continuous source of friction. Communities dependent on cross-border commerce begin to deteriorate. Neither government acknowledges error. The damage compounds year by year until a new generation inherits a diminished relationship and accepts it as simply the way things have always been. The third scenario is rupture, the outcome that diplomats on both sides of the border have spent decades working to prevent. Trump's threats become actions, portions of the NORAD Accord suspended, intelligence exchange halted, troops sent to the Canadian border. Canada formally ends its cooperation and begins negotiating security arrangements with Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. America's other allies, watching the conflict, begin recalculating their own interests. The Western Alliance, the defining security framework of the free world since the Second World War, begins to fracture along lines that may never be fully repaired. NATO confronts an internal crisis it was never designed to manage. The entire architecture of multilateral cooperation that has sustained stability and prosperity in the Western world for 8 decades faces unparalleled strain. Senior national security officials in multiple countries are actively planning for this contingency. It is no longer unimaginable. The next 72 hours may be the most consequential in the history of United States-Canada relations. There are specific signals worth watching. The first is whether a former American president issues a public call for de-escalation. Such a declaration would carry substantial weight and might provide the current president with political cover to retreat from his more extreme threats without appearing to concede to Canada, particularly if it came from a predecessor still respected within the Republican Party. The second indicator is whether Canada responds with any tangible, non-rhetorical retaliation. Carney's statement was powerful, but it was words. If Ottawa begins rerouting economic relationships, if Canadian officials publicly suspend specific cooperative arrangements, or if the Canadian military makes any visible adjustments to its operational posture, it signals that Carney intends to follow through. The third and most important indicator is whether Trump retracts his threat to review the NORAD agreement specifically. Most other aspects of this crisis are recoverable. Trade agreements can be renegotiated, tariffs can be adjusted, diplomatic language can be walked back, but NORAD is different. NORAD is the cornerstone of North American security. If the United States government formally calls that commitment into question, the damage to the security relationship and to American credibility as an alliance partner with every other nation on earth may be irreparable. Mark Carney stood at a podium and declared that the American era is over. Donald Trump responded by proposing that Canadian provinces join the United States. America's closest allies openly sided with Canada. The Pentagon is in alarm. The State Department is in disarray. Congressional leaders are concerned but constitutionally constrained. The moment that foreign policy scholars and historians had been cautioning about for years has arrived more swiftly than nearly anyone predicted, the point at which the pressures on the American-led international system exceeded what diplomacy alone could contain. A neighboring nation, pushed to the breaking point by an administration that treats agreements as obstacles and partners as subordinates, stood up and said, "Enough." Whether the relationship between the United States and Canada has been fundamentally altered is no longer an open question. It has been. That transformation was complete the moment Carney walked out of the National Press Theater without answering a single question. The more urgent question, the one that will define American foreign policy, American credibility, and the American character for years to come, is what we intend to do about it.